Thank you for being here tonight. I'm Pastor Diane Loffman, the pastor of First Lutheran. We gathered tonight to name the sin of racism that fractures human relationships, defaces God's beautiful mosaic of human creation, and does violence and harm to God's people. We gather asking God to know our hearts, to cleanse them of ungodliness and fill them with goodness. As we remember Elias Clayton, Elmer Jackson, and Isaac McGhie, innocent men who were hanged in Duluth, not far from here, on June 15th, 1920, we cannot help but recall that Jesus, who was also innocent, was also hanged from a tree. On Good Friday, Christians remember Jesus' 7 last words. Tonight, we remember the last words of 7 unarmed Black men unjustly killed, even as we remember the names of too many others. Please rise as you are comfortable to sing our hymn.
As the blood of Abel, who was slain by his brother Cain, cried out to God from the ground upon which it was spilled, so the blood of our brothers and sisters of color cries out for justice. We name aloud today, along with the names of Clayton, Jackson, and McGhie, some of the victims of racial violence in our country's history. As we do so, we confess our complicity and the complicity of our whole society in their unjust, violent deaths. As we do so, we remember God's word spoken through the prophet. I have redeemed you. I have called you by name. You are mine.
Elias Clayton, Elmer Jackson, Isaac McGhie, Emmett Till, Medgar Evers, Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr., Trayvon Martin, Eric Garner, Michael Brown, Freddie Gray, Laquan McDonald, Walter Scott, Tamir Rice, Elijah McLean, Jamar Clark, Sandra Bland, Hadaya Pendleton, Brianna Taylor, Ahmad Arbery, Philando Castile, George Floyd, Dante Wright,
Along with these individuals, we also remember those who have died in incidents of mass racial violence in this country, including
the Buffalo, New York supermarket shooting on May 14th this year, which took the lives of 10 Black people and injured 3 more based on a white man's fear of replacement theory.
The Tulsa, Oklahoma race massacre 101 years ago on May 31st, when many African Americans were killed and thousands were left homeless as the prosperous Black neighborhood of Greenwood was destroyed.
The bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama in September 1963, which took the lives of 4 young girls, Addie Mae Collins, Cynthia Wesley, Carol Robertson, and Carol Denise McNair.
The Mother Emanuel Church mass shooting in Charleston, South Carolina, 7 years ago on June 17th, which took the lives of Reverend Clementa Pinckney and 8 others.
a cry of lament is the rending of our hearts, knowing that we have grieved the very heart of God, from Joel and Ephesians. With all these victims of racial violence, named and unnamed, with those still being targeted, and with the voices of the psalmists, we raise our voices to God in lament.
How long, O Lord, will you forget us forever? How long will you hide your face from us? My God, Why have you forsaken us?
Why
so far from saving us, so far from the words of our groaning? Out of the depths we cry to you, O Lord.
O Lord, hear our voice.
Let your ears be attentive to the voice of our supplication. Hear our prayer, O Lord.
Listen to our cry.
A reading from 2 Samuel, the 13th chapter. Some time passed. David's son Absalom had a beautiful sister whose name was Tamar, and David's son Amnon fell in love with her. Amnon was so tormented that he made himself ill because of his sister Tamar, for she was a virgin, and it seemed impossible to Amnon to do anything to her. But Amnon had a friend whose name was Jonadab, the son of David's brother Shimea, and Jonadab was a very crafty man. He said to him, "O son of the king, why are you so haggard morning after morning? Will you not tell me?" Amnon said to him, "I love Tamar, my brother Absalom's sister." Jonadab said to him, "Lie down on your bed and pretend to be ill. And when your father comes to see you, say to him, 'Let my sister Tamar come and give me something to eat, and prepare the food in my sight so that I may see it and eat from her hand.'" So Amnon lay down and pretended to be ill, and when the king came to see him, Amnon said to the king, "Please let my sister Tamar come and make a couple of cakes in my sight, so that I may eat from her hand." Then David sent home to Tamar, saying, "Go to your brother Amnon's house and prepare food for him." So Tamar went to her brother Amnon's house where he was lying down. She took dough, kneaded it, made cakes in his sight, and baked the cakes. Then she took the pan and set them before him, but he refused to eat. Amnon said, "Send out every one from me." So everyone went out from him. Then Amnon said to Tamar, "Bring the food into the chamber so that I may eat from your hand." So Tamar took the cakes she had made and brought them into the chamber to Amnon, her brother. But when she brought them near him to eat, he took hold of her hand and said to her, "Come, lie with me, my sister." She answered him, "No, my brother, do not force me, for such a thing is not done in Israel. Do not do anything so vile. As for me, where could I carry my shame? And as for you, you would be as one of the scoundrels in Israel. Now therefore I beg you, speak to the king, for he will not withhold me from you." But he would not listen to her, and being stronger than she, he forced her and lay with her. Then Amnon was seized with a very great loathing for her. Indeed, his loathing was even greater than the lust he had felt for her. Amnon said to her, "Get out." But she said to him, "No, my brother, for this wrong in sending me away is greater than the other that you did to me." But he would not listen to her. He called the young man who served him and said, "Put this woman out of my presence and bolt the door after her." Now she was wearing an ornamented robe with sleeves, for this is how the virgin daughters of the king were clothed in earlier times. So his servant put her out and bolted the door after her. But Tamar put ashes on her head and tore the long robe that she was wearing. She put her hand on her head and went away, crying aloud as she went. Her brother Absalom said to her, "Has Amnon, your brother, been with you? Be quiet for now, my sister. He is your brother. Do not take this to heart." So Tamar remained a desolate woman in her brother Absalom's house. When King David heard of all these things, he became very angry. But He would not punish his son Amnon because he loved him, for he was his firstborn. But Absalom spoke to Amnon, neither good nor bad, for Absalom hated Amnon because he had raped his sister Tamar. I wonder, did you notice how Amnon started to hate Tamar? Why? Because she reminded him of his own evil, his transgression. Isn't that what we do? We want those who remind us of our brokenness to disappear, or we disappear them. Which is what had happened to Clayton, Jackson, and McGhie. They weren't talked about. They weren't named. They weren't part of school curriculums for a long, long time. The story was buried. We might say in some cases this horrific act still isn't named enough or taught thoroughly enough in schools so that young people know this story and ask about its meaning. How many times I have heard white people not want to hear the history of African Americans because it makes them feel bad or because they don't want their children to think poorly of themselves. We want to put these hard stories of men unjustly killed away. We don't want to wrestle with what it means about us, about our society, about our refusal to come to terms with our history. This story of Tamar is so painful that it is never read in our churches. We follow a 3-year calendar of readings. Never is Tamar's story read. I don't know if it's read in synagogues. She was silenced then, and she is silenced now. We don't want to come to worship to hear a story of rape, of a father, King David, who knows the truth but refuses to speak. His firstborn son, heir to the throne. Hush, hush, you have to protect his image, his legacy. Can't upset the power structure. Or is David, like his son, not wanting to look at something that means he has to look at himself? For who taught Amnon to take a woman against her will? Did he not do the same with Bathsheba? Did he not see to it that Uriah, Bathsheba's husband, would be killed to cover up David's transgression when Bathsheba was made pregnant by his act? Silence is a damaging and a damning thing. It leads not to a future freed from the past, but to a future forever bound to repeat the past. And then evil things, ungodly things are done to keep the past, to keep truth from coming out. This is why we gather tonight, because we are unafraid to name the truth of what happened in Duluth to Clayton, Jackson, and McGhie. Because we know in naming it, we reject the sins of denial and pretense that lead to repetition. We put ourselves on watch to make sure it doesn't happen again. Or when it does happen again, as all the people and places we have named reveal, we stand over against those acts and speak and act in opposition to them. There is silencing in the story of Tamar, but it actually is not Tamar who is, in the end, silent. David the king is angry at what his son has done, but he falls silent to protect his reputation. Amnon is silent because he doesn't want to own what he has done. And Absalom, instead of using his words, becomes more like his brother than Tamar. He lets his anger at what his brother has done turn to hatred, and he will speak in the future with weapons of violence. But Tamar, who seemingly had no power, refuses to be silenced. I heard a sermon on this text by Otis Moss III, who's pastor of Trinity United Church of Christ in Chicago, who reminded me of that. Tamar does refuse to be silenced. She doesn't have a pulpit. She doesn't have a throne. She doesn't have a microphone, a social media platform, a TV show. She isn't even given a place in our lectionary. But she refuses to be silenced by putting on sackcloth and ashes. And it speaks loudly because the text talks about the beautiful clothing women royalty like Tamar wore. But she replaces those beautiful robes with sackcloth and ashes so everyone could see and everyone would know and everyone would ask, what happened to Tamar? That's why we have a Clayton Jackson McGhie Memorial, so that people will see it and ask, what happened here? What happened to these men? Why did others stand silent or even cheering when it did? It's why we remember this day, so people will know what happened. Dishearteningly, it's a day like way too many days that we should be wearing sackcloth and ashes. And maybe that's what we should do every time there is an act of racial violence, every time there is an injustice against people on the basis of the very way God has created them. We should all put on sackcloth and ashes as our pledge to never be silent in the face of racial injustice. Maybe if we all who stand over against white nationalism and white supremacy and the evil of replacement theory thinking wear sackcloth and ashes, we could look around us and see who is for us and who is against us. Though ultimately the question is, who stands on the side of God and who stands against God? Ever since I heard that phrase, replacement theory, all I could think of is the replacement theory that I believe in, which is that we follow a creator, a God. Whether we are Native American or Jewish or Muslim or Christian, we follow a God who seeks to replace hardened hearts with hearts of flesh, replace fear with love, replace hatred with acceptance, replace violence with peace, replace silence in the face of injustice with voices that refuse to be silenced, and acts of justice that alter our path. Tonight we hear the last words of African American men unjustly killed. We sing and hear their words, refusing to let them be silenced. As we lift up our prayers of lament, you are invited as you are moved to light a candle on our tree of life. Remembering that God created all of humanity in God's very image, we bring our unnamed fears into the light. The fear of being a minority in what we call our country.
The fear of losing dominance, the fear of change, and the fear of losing the grip on the pen that writes history. Our hearts are grieved. Lead us in your way.
We acknowledge the painful conversations it is too easy to avoid, and we confess the ways we teach our children biases that flourish from generation to generation.
Our hearts are grieved. Lead us in your way. We have been complicit in how racism continues to exclude people of color, especially in policy areas including public safety, education, employment, housing, and healthcare in our community. We have not understood our need to advocate for structural change so that everyone in our community can benefit equally. Our hearts are grieved. Lead us in your way.
For too long, we have been covering up the lynchings in Duluth. For too long, we have been silent about this tragedy. We grieve the pain this has caused our siblings of color, the ways we have denied them justice. Our hearts are grieved.
Lead us in your way. For too long, we have been silent in the face of so many deaths that have grieved your heart, O God, but not our own. As we have named some of them today, we grieve our silence and indifference to the white supremacy and racial bigotry that led to their violent deaths. Our hearts are grieved. Lead us in your way.
For too long, we have ignored the impacts of historical and generational trauma, and our efforts to work for peace, reconciliation, and equity have been meager at best.
Our hearts are grieved. Lead us in your way. We confess that our churches are still places that reflect the societal divisions we have fostered. Our hearts are grieved. Lead us in your way.
As we reflect on our daily interactions with people and community of color, we call to you.
Our hearts are grieved. Lead us in your way. As we contemplate what we have done and what we have left undone, we call to you. Open our hearts, O God.
As we labor together to create a more loving and safe community for all of our siblings of color, where the divine image and dignity we all share is celebrated, we call to you.
Open our hearts.
Holy and merciful God, the first letter of John declares, "There is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear." May your perfect love cast out all fear that prevents us from bearing witness to your love in our words and in our actions, individually and communally. Lead us in the ways of love, that we might truly love one another as you have first loved us. Amen.